If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war.
My latest prediction, this is my January issue, beware of a black swan event that could derail the longest running bull market in history.
China has identified the cause of the mysterious pneumonia outbreak in Wuhan city.
This is the front line of the epidemic in Wuhan. A new 1,000-bed hospital being built from scratch in less than a week.
Italian hospitals are at their absolute limit, with hundreds more deaths reported daily.
It's escalating. The number of cases is clearly going up in a very steep slope.
As you're speaking, the World Health Organization has just declared that this is a pandemic.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe.
Tom Hanks just tweeted, he and his wife, they have coronavirus.
Breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ. The NBA has suspended the season after Rudy Gobert has tested positive for coronavirus.
It was a very bad day in markets, with some are calling it a new Black Monday. The Dow today fell by 13%, S&P down 12%.
Say the woman yelled obscenities at customers after an employee asked her to wear her face mask.
I will sign an executive order today closing public schools for the rest of the school year.
We've now seen 44 million Americans file for unemployment benefits.
A park ranger shoved into the water at Lake Austin. The ranger was asking the crowd to social distance.
Where we are today, you will be in 3 weeks. We are your future.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Mark Skousen, the producer of FreedomFest. We are delighted to have you here for our special virtual emergency meeting. And I want to start off with a quote from Sir Harry Schultz, who said, "Never underestimate the size of a panic and the power of a politician." And at the beginning of the year, I had written a special January report in my newsletter, Forecasts and Strategies. I have a picture of it right here. And in it, I made the prediction at the beginning of the year, quote, "The outlook for stocks, gold, and the dollar is positive as we enter 2020, but beware of a black swan event that could derail the longest running bull market in history." And I should have added, and our annual Freedom Fest conference. So we're calling this emergency meeting because we're expecting huge changes. We've already seen huge changes in our economy, politics, culture, and the stock market and gold and so forth. And we want to focus. We have 4 panels that we're drawing from out of the over 100 speakers we have at Freedom Fest. We are calling upon 15 experts, speakers at our conference to give us an update of where we see where we're headed. We're going to start with our first panel, which is with Dr. Joel Hay, who's the USC health economist and an expert of over 50 years experience on pandemics. We also have Carrie McDonald, who is an expert on education, who is with the Foundation for Economic Education and FEE, as well as the Cato Institute. We have the world's greatest tech guru, George Gilder, who is going to join us and has just recently returned from China. And finally, we have Terry Kibbe, who is the co-president of freethepeople.com, who will give us her perspective on what's happening with think tanks, think tanks and freedom organizations around the world. So we welcome you to our very first panel, and let's get started. And again, welcome our 4 panelists. If we can now ask them a series of questions. There we have a picture of all 4 of them. And we're going to start with Dr. Joel Hay. Dr. Hay, let me ask you right from the beginning, if the imperial governor of Nevada had given us special dispensation for FreedomFest 2020, if we could have held FreedomFest 2020 starting today in Las Vegas, what would have been the outcome? Would people have died? Would people have gotten the coronavirus? Would it have disrupted our 1,500 or however many people we had? What would you say to that question?
Can you hear me, Mark? Just want to make sure audio's okay.
Yep, sounds
thanks
good.
For having me. Great. Thanks for having me at the meeting, and I certainly am sympathetic to the fact that you can't have your meeting, even though that's totally unconstitutional, violates the First Amendment and several other amendments. But to answer your question directly, no. If the governor of Nevada had allowed you to have your conference or anybody else to have their conferences as normal, as in any normal year, we would have seen absolutely no increases in deaths. Very little increases in overall mild symptoms, maybe a few more hospitalizations. But the reason I am so positive that there would be no increased deaths is because I track that data with my team of machine learning, big data, AI, data scientists, and econometricians, and health economists, and clinicians. And we can prove about 10 different ways that the virus was everywhere back in the fall of 2019. So a lockdown in 2020, March, makes no sense. It was already all over the globe a year earlier. We can prove that. And so your conference wouldn't have caused anything. Just as, for example, if you remember all those riots and meetings and protests where thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were crammed together, and many of them weren't wearing masks, and many of them weren't doing any social isolation protections. And guess what? There was no spike in deaths. And it's now been 30 days since the George Floyd protests and non-social isolation and non-mask wearing. And there was no spike in deaths in any of those places that had those close contacts. And I think you are going to be even more responsible than some of those organizations in terms of you are going to actually follow some rules about social distancing.
Well, in fact, Joel, let me interrupt for just a minute by asking you the question. Everybody is demanding that it's mandatory for you to wear masks. Everybody wants to know, what does the science say about this? Are masks effective in keeping you from getting the coronavirus?
No, masks are totally useless for many, many reasons, again, including the fact that the virus particle can fit through the mesh of a typical mask about like a bullet could fit through a screen door fencing. A screen door fencing is not going to stop a bullet. And you're not going to stop this virus. This virus was everywhere, as I say, so long ago that wearing a mask is just silly. And in fact, I was kicked out by security of a hospital last night because they would not treat me because the mask kept slipping off my nose. And I had to use my nose to breathe. because it fogs up my glasses, by the way. I cannot see. And I'm 67 years old, and my vision ain't perfect. And they wouldn't let me see. So they were trading a fake condition, wearing a mask to protect against nothing, for a real condition, fogging up my glasses so I couldn't see and fill out all their stupid paperwork. So
Joel,
after
let me ask you another quick question, because we have 30 minutes for each panel, so we need to move on to our other panelists. But one final question: is a vaccine the answer? Everyone keeps talking about, well, we need a vaccine in order for us to move back to a normal condition. What's the outlook for a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus?
Okay, the outlook for a vaccine for COVID-19 is the silliest question I've ever heard. It'd be about like, let's get a vaccine for seawater. So if you get exposed to seawater, you won't die. I mean, it's literally that stupid. And let me tell you why. C19 is a coronavirus. It's SARS-CoV-2. It is like a bunch of other coronaviruses, and they're all over. They've been around forever, millions of years. We're still trying to figure out how to handle the SARS coronavirus itself. Remember, there's SARS coronavirus 1. Remember, that was 20 years ago. It's been 20 years. We have no vaccine for it. And by the way, that virus is more lethal because it stays further down in the lung area, the upper respiratory tract, whereas C19 stays up in the nasal pharynx, and it's just not lethal up there. It's very infectious. And remember, a key postulate of epidemiology that everyone forgets in the epidemiology field, but they should all know it. Farr's law, F-A-R-R''S, Google it, Farr's law. The more rapid an infectious disease can spread, the less lethal it has to be, and vice versa. A highly lethal virus, parasite, bacteria, whatever, can't go very fast because it's killing people too quickly. If this virus is the most rapidly spreading virus in the history of the planet, which we can now prove, it is also one of the least lethal. And if you look at the data, everyone who died from C19 would have been dead 2 to 8 weeks later, and we can prove that with the CDC excess mortality statistics. Just go look it up. It's right on the front of my website this morning, joelhay.com. Click on the excess mortality statistics that my team put up there, and you will see that essentially what happened in the C19 panic pandemic is the healthcare workers panicked, and we've got film evidence of this. This isn't made up. We've got actual nurses who smuggled in and watched it happen, and you can go to the websites and look at the smuggled in film where the healthcare workers in New York City, in the Brooklyn hospitals, were killing patients early by shoving ventilators down their throats, giving them the wrong medications, not treating them, too scared to treat them. So there were 100,000 excess deaths in April in the United States. Those deaths would have happened in May and June. And all you have to do is go to my website and click on the NCI excess deaths calculator, and you will see that C19 killed nobody at all. But what happened was the panicked healthcare workers killed about 100,000 Americans too early.
Joel, thank you. Thank you very much for that assessment. I think you would probably agree that, and we'll move now to Carrie McDonald and talk about education. All the schools are continuing, including USC, Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard. They're all closing down for the fall, all going online. How is this affecting? I mean, it's obvious that this is why I had Dr. Joel Hay on this program, because he was going to give us a view that is not what we're hearing in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, frankly. And so, Carrie, tell us how is this impacting? What are the permanent changes we're seeing in education? Is homeschooling the new thing? Where do you see education going in this regard?
Right. Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be with you tonight and fellow panelists. Yeah, we are really living through a transformational moment in American education. This spring, there were over 50 million U.S. K-12 students who were released from school due to the pandemic and thrust into this at-home learning experience with varying degrees of connection to their local school. Despite the forced nature of this displacement, just a few weeks into the shutdowns, a survey by EdChoice found that more than half of the respondents had a more favorable view of homeschooling in light of the pandemic than they did beforehand. So even though, of course, everyone was disconnected from their communities and from the people, places, and things around them, parents said, hey, gee, this isn't that bad. It's actually better than we thought it might be. And a more recent USA Today poll found that 60% of parents are likely to keep their kids home from school to continue with at-home learning or independent homeschooling, even if schools reopen this fall. Much of this is due really to the CDC guidelines for school reopening that create these really strict, severe social distancing requirements for schools with all-day mask use and distanced desks and playground restrictions and no toy sharing for young children and no gyms and no cafeteria. So parents are saying, gee, we might have some lingering fears about the actual virus, particularly if we might have children who have direct contact with some vulnerable individuals. But for the most part, we don't want to send our kids to these school buildings because of the response to this pandemic, because of these strict social distancing requirements. So many of them are just keeping their kids at home. I think this is a massive shift in power away from government institutions and towards families that I predict will likely have ripple effects for years to come.
So George, I believe you just turned 80. Is this correct? You're 80 years old?
But more, my mother just turned 102. She was born in the middle of Spanish flu that killed 50 million people around the world without closing down the economy.
So George, you were fearless. You were willing to come to FreedomFest along with, obviously Joel Hay had no concerns. You're in the vulnerable age, right, of 80 years of age, and yet you were willing to come. So what science are you looking at?
I'm looking at the same science Joel is expounding. I look at death rates, by all-cause death rates, and all through my life expectancies have extended. When my mother was born in 1918, the average was about 40 years old. And all through her subsequent 102 years, life expectancies have been growing and growing better and better. And 2020 scarcely affects that trend in any way. We're more likely to live longer today than ever before.
So George, how important is technology, biotechnology? How important is the getting vaccines? Do you get a flu shot every year? Do you go through these, or is it? You do get a flu shot.
Should I get a flu shot, Joel? Is that a mistake? I can't hear him, but
yeah, I think you're muted, maybe.
Sorry. At this point, I would say it probably is advisable to get a flu shot, but after C-19, I've learned how much the doctors are lying to us about everything, literally everything in medicine. I'm going to reevaluate everything. But the evidence I've seen thus far suggests flu shots are beneficial.
So let's.
I have a flu shot. I took a flu shot.
So George, are you? you're a very healthy 80-year-old. You said you ran 3 miles today. You have a good diet. You're fairly thin. You seem to. Why don't we spend more time? Talk about permanent changes. Carrie said education is changing. Is this changing the way people behave in terms of diet? I mean, I've heard that the average person has gained weight and is because they're sitting at home, they're not out activity and so on. I see Terry has a comment on that. Terry, you want to make a comment on that? You look like
No, I was just raising my hand because I was one of those people that gained about 5 pounds during the last 3 months.
Oh, you did. Terry, I would just like to get from you your assessment. Carrie said that there's permanent changes in education and online education and homeschooling and so forth. What about the think tanks and the freedom organizations? Are they financially struggling now? People aren't helping like they used to. You did a great job, by the way, in getting Senator Rand Paul and his wife Kelly and Justin Amash and Mike Lee, and you were getting a lot of people to come to the FreedomFest conference. What's the attitude people have as we're heading into an election year?
Well, you just asked me about 47 questions in the span of 10 seconds, so I'll try to remember everything that you asked. So I can't speak for other organizations and their financial positions right now. At Free the People, we've been doing just fine. When the pandemic started, we changed our entire business model and focused everything that we were doing on COVID-19, not necessarily on the medical science, because that's not who we are, but looking at the challenges that people were facing and did a ton of videos on the loss of religious freedom, economic freedom, civil rights, and all across the board. We did a video then, we were like, wow, we're getting really depressing here, but there is some good things that have happened. So we made this great video called The Unstoppable Human Spirit, which talked about individuals taking responsibility and how companies and entrepreneurs stepped up and distilleries started making hand sanitizer because the other companies weren't making enough and you couldn't get it, and 3D printing respirators and all of that. So we started looking at the more positive side of trying to find the more positive side in being locked down. As far as the political fallout from this, I do believe that politicians that have taken such an exceedingly authoritarian approach to this pandemic and the lockdown are going to pay a political price. I mean, you had cities and countries or cities and states across the country completely locked down until the Black Lives Matter protests started. And then suddenly it was just okay and wonderful to get out and exert your First Amendment right to free speech. But then organizations and things like FreedomFest couldn't happen. We just got back from Orlando, Florida, where we attended the Libertarian Party convention in person. There was about 350 people there. Some were wearing masks, some weren't, some were practicing social distancing, some weren't. It was up to every individual to take their own personal risk factors into account and conduct themselves accordingly. Before we went to Orlando, we went to Alaska. We live in DC, like 2 blocks from the Capitol. You want to talk about the belly of the beast and the heart of the swamp, that's where we are. And it was pretty bad. We were completely locked up, shut down, and living here, all we were exposed to was the progressive woke left and all of the mainstream media. And it was starting to get to us. So we had to get out. We went as far away as we could, and we went to Alaska. And we were there over the 4th of July, and it was the best thing that we could have done. We kind of were re-energized and ready to come back and fight the good fight. On the 4th of July, everyone was wearing red, white, and blue and wishing people happy Independence Day. But the most important thing that we discovered while we were there was what was happening back here in the lower 48. It had been okay to protest for Black Lives Matter, but suddenly it was unsafe to celebrate Independence Day. Government-sponsored fireworks were shut down. I mean, it was crazy. So what happened?
But Terry, I should mention here in Orange County, it was like a war zone. The fireworks were going on everywhere in LA area, even though, and it was all illegal. Total. So that gave me hope that maybe civil disobedience has not. I mean, everybody's been forced to wear these masks and so on. We're definitely into conformity in a very big way, and it's a little bit disturbing.
Yeah, well, Mark, you beat me to my punchline because I was about to say, but then we saw videos all over Instagram and Facebook about the skies over Chicago and LA just alight with individuals and families shooting off their illegal fireworks. So it shows that there is still this individualism in America. And I think that it's an opportunity for us who are, fighting in the liberty movement and fighting for people's freedom to really step up. I mean, as politicians say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So they always use crises to pass more and more onerous regulations. Well, we in the freedom movement need to do the same thing. We shouldn't let this crisis go to waste, and we should just double down and fight even harder for what we know this country can do and what we're all about.
Yeah, thank you very much, Terry. George, I wanted to, we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to get your perspective on China because your book on Google, Life After Google, became a bestseller, #2, I understand, in China. You were invited to go back and forth. Did you preach free markets and independence? And I mean, you probably weren't there during the pandemic where everyone was wearing a mask, but give us a short assessment of your view on China. Is that a real threat?
I think the real threat to the United States is the United States. It's these, when you started talking about having this meeting in Caesar's palace, I began to worry. I mean, we discovered there's Caesars in America. It's not just Sid. We got real Caesars. They're called governors. We got one in Massachusetts out here. And
Massachusetts.
we got Governor Baker. He's supposedly a Republican, but he's really a phasist. He's phasing in freedom and phasing out freedom, really. And but I think that China is probably more capitalist than we are now. And I think the big development in the next year is going to be a recognition that the central banks of the world have finally crashed the monetary system irretrievably. And cryptocurrencies are going to have a big resurgence. There's going to be all sorts of inventiveness in the propagation of cryptocurrencies around the world. It's going to be the great breakthrough of free money that Hayek and von Mises called for. And I think that's going to be exciting. That both the key crises of the digital economy, the breakdown of internet security, and the hacking of world money, central banks, will be remedied by creativity from the cryptocosm. I tell you all about it in Life After Google.
That's true. Thank you very much, George. Carrie, do you want to make our final comment about where are we headed? What kind of permanent changes? What do you see in terms of, I mean, are we going to, maybe Dr. Joel Hay could comment on this too. I mean, is this now going to be a annual event? Whenever there's an influenza, are we going to shut down the economy? Is online education becoming a permanent change in our culture?
Well, I certainly hope this is not the new normal for long, and that we realize that the shutdowns and the response to the virus have been severe and have tremendous consequences for individual lives and livelihoods throughout our country and the world. I think in particularly in education, and I would say elsewhere in other industries as well, this is a tremendous moment and opportunity for entrepreneurship. And I think, if we take anything hopeful or optimistic, I think it's looking at certainly what I see in the education space as innovators inventing new tools and resources and methodologies and platforms for learning, whether it's virtual learning or micro schools, or sort of in-home co-ops that families are coming together, gathering together to run, to try to really avoid these sort of institutional responses to COVID-19 and show tremendous ingenuity, not only currently in how to cope with the fall in terms of learning, but I think in the long term as well.
Joel, you got one minute to tell us that hopefully never again. Is that what we're going to see, or are we headed for more of these lockdowns?
Climate change.
If I only have a minute, let me speak very rapidly. I was not trained as a health economist. I was trained as a macroeconomist under James Tobin and Charlene Koopmans at Yale. So my field is macroeconomics. I'm one of the founders of health economics, and I created the field, or one of the creators, but my real area is macro, and I'm scared. We have injected a lot of poison into our economy. We've got 60 million unemployed. Now, we've got governors cratering. They think they're petty executives, like George said, but guess what? How the hell are they going to pay for all this? The governor of California has a $60 billion deficit. That's why I moved to Nevada. He's not going to take my taxes to pay for his $60 billion deficit. He's got to balance his budget. How's he going to do that? How are we going to balance the federal budget when we're spitting out welfare checks and unemployment checks right and left, and no one's got jobs? We're going into hyperinflation, folks, in the next 5 years. You see this as, okay, maybe things are going to come back. It's a new normal. No, we've got poison that is just starting to hit the system, and we're going to see hyperinflation. I see no other way out.
Well, so that's it is. You've given us a little bit of a pessimistic view there. Obviously, that we would like to see us get out of these kinds of problems. But you are absolutely right, Joel. We are facing a major headwinds given what has happened. And so I want to thank our panel. We're going to thank our panel, George and Carrie and Joel and Terry. Thank you very much. I know this was short and sweet, but I think we got our message across. And then we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to have 3 or 4 other experts on the Global Economic Summit. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to our second panel, our Global Economic Summit. We're delighted to have Steve Moore with us from the Heritage Foundation and the Committee to Unleash the Economy. We certainly need that today. We have Lee Schooland from Hawaii, who is an expert on China. We're delighted to have her here. We have Barbara Combe, who is from Austria. She is a vice president of the central bank in Austria. Isn't that correct? And then we have Roberto Salinas from Mexico, who's going to tell us about Latin America. So we're covering the globe here with the next half hour. And let me just start with Steve Moore. Steve, if you can respond to several doom and gloomers. You in the past, you and Art Laffer have been super bullish in the past, very optimistic about the economy and so on. But Nouriel Roubini, as well as our old friend Doug Casey, have been calling for a greater depression. And even you at times have talked about a very serious, we're facing a serious depression type of environment in the United States. Tell us your views. Have you changed your views? Do you think we're coming out of this this Great Depression unemployment situation? Or in fact, let me do it in terms of letter. Is North America, the United States, going to have an economy that is a V-shaped recovery, L-shaped, U-shaped, W-shaped, or M-shaped? What would you say, Steve?
Hi, Mark. Good to be with you and great to be with my fellow panelists. I'm so sorry we can't be in Las Vegas, but this is the next best thing. So, Mark, congratulations on putting this together. I guess I am, it depends on what day you ask me about the economy. I go through dramatic mood shifts from one day to the other based on what's going on from a policy perspective. As we speak right now, Mark, the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ are going through the roof. This has been a huge, I just checked 15 minutes ago, the Dow was up 500 points. The NASDAQ was up by 200 points. It's just shattering all records. The Dow's only 10% off of its high before the coronavirus hit. Would I buy stocks right now? Hell no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't buy American stocks right now. I mean, these prices seem highly inflated to me because I think American investors have underestimated, Mark, what a massive hole we put our economy in and how hard it is going to get out of this. I think investors have underestimated the extent to which Joe Biden could win the election. I do think Trump is going to win, but this thing's going to be a dogfight right down to the end. And Biden could win. I'd put his odds at 40 to 50%. If that happens, I just finished writing a piece, Mark, on Biden's tax plan. It is catastrophic for investors. It raises our corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. It raises our capital gains rate from 23.8% to almost 40%. It raises our death tax for most stock, which is now not taxed at all at death, to a 40% tax rate. These are gigantic tax increases on investors. That I'm surprised, Mark, that the market, as I see it, maybe you see it a little differently. I don't think the market has really fully, priced in the very, very negative effects of a Biden presidency would have on stocks. I mean, he just released this tax plan last week, and it is very frightening me. I've never seen anything quite like it. In
fact, let me mention, Steve, let me give a big plug for your hotline, your Unleash the Economy hotline. Can you tell us how our attendees can get a hold of your hotline? That's the best daily hotline anybody is putting out, and everybody needs to get this. So can they just Google Committee to Unleash the Economy? Would that get them to the hotline?
It's called, if you just Google Committee to Unleash Prosperity, and you just, the front page of the website will have it's a free newsletter, but you have to affirmatively sign on to it. And I'll just stop by saying, I think there's an incredibly uncertain time for the economy. I think the election is going to matter a lot. And I also think but I do think I'm optimistic actually about where we are with the coronavirus. I do think actually, despite all the newspaper headlines of Armageddon, I think we're starting to see this thing burn itself out. Death rates are falling. And I think by the fall, we could have a good situation with respect to dramatic reductions in caseloads and deaths. And that is an important part of this, because the economy can't grow if people are going outside, if businesses aren't open, and if schools aren't open. That's the last thing I'll say. We got to get our schools open, Mark. You can't have a functioning economy without schools open and somewhere for kids to go and learn so that parents can go out and work.
Absolutely. And let's switch to Barbara Combe and talk about Europe. Does Europe face a similar situation? I know Sweden was one of the only countries in Europe that decided not to do a total lockdown. They did a partial lockdown. They've been criticized for very high levels of the virus and death rates, although they had 5,000 death rates in Sweden out of 10 million people. It still doesn't seem like a big number. But are you facing big tax increases? Are you facing a Great Depression in Europe? Is it the same story that the United States is facing, or are you more optimistic?
Well, first of all, I think we've never seen something like that, destroying the economy within 2 weeks by all those lockdowns. And this is definitely a tragedy. On the one hand, of course, you had to save lives back then in March when this was done, nobody knew really what would happen, what kind of pandemic this was. So politicians did what they did. They just tried to do their best on the one hand, but on the other hand, they completely forgot about the economy. And this comes back to your question right now, Mark. What we saw is, or what we see is, all those emergency purchasing programs put on by the ECB on the one hand, it's 750 trillion euros. And then the European Commission puts exactly the same amount into the pot again. So this is more than 3.4 trillion, which makes up 25% of the entire EU GDP. And somebody will have to pay the price. So in other words, it will be the taxpayers. And interestingly, the EU called their program Next Generation EU. So it will be the next generation and the generation after who will have to pay the price for that. And of course, Social Democrats in Germany, but also in Austria, the Green Party is already debating higher rising of taxes, and whether it's inheritance tax or wealth tax, and taxes on the economies, on the enterprises. So we will face those tax issues and those risings of taxes. And this is this will be a huge disaster, because we all know what Arthur Laffer said. Reduce those taxes and not rise them, because revenue streams will eventually be reduced the higher the taxes on those enterprises are, and they will not create jobs by not being competitive, because trust me, China and other parts of the world will do exactly the opposite. And if we look at the numbers of when it comes to real GDP per capita average right now in Europe, we are about minus 7.7 in the euro area. We would not have believed that 4 months ago, when we were still in the pluses, and not, of course, in the good rates that China and the US had. But right now, just to give you a couple of numbers, the United Kingdom is minus 8.3, and Germany is minus 7.2, France minus 9.3. Italy minus 9, Spain minus 11.6. And I could go on like that, but these are just the numbers of 2020 and as of May. So if we add the numbers, the current numbers that I just got from the central bank and from the commission today, which amounts to a higher negative rate, in average right now we are at minus 8%. And wow. One has to consider, and this is the last sentence on this issue, they all think there will be a cure or a vaccine within the next year, or within 9 to 12 months. This is priced in their models. So if there is nothing, well, I don't know what governments and politicians will do. But on the other hand, on the positive thing, and here I come back to Sweden. Sweden has been bashed by many politicians and by many, especially in the continent, for not shutting down the country and for not closing down. And what we see and what we hear from our friends in not only in Stockholm, but especially in the south of Sweden, where you also have a conglomerate of industries, it's not as bad as many politicians and as many reporters report on continental Europe. Stockholm is back to normal, more or less. And of course, the death rates were higher, but this was the risk they took not to shut down the economy. The schools were still working, whereas for us in Austria, kids can go to school now. We were the first country to open and go back to normal by the end of April. But the losses in terms of economy and both individual and economic freedom are tremendous. And I think this downside has to be discussed, because if we lose our individual freedom because of political decisions, I think this is a much higher threat than anything else that we have seen.
Amen to that. Thank you very much for that report, Barbara. Let's go to Roberto Salinas, who is in Mexico City. I see you have a series of books in the background, no doubt. One of those has to be one of my books, I'm sure. But We can't hear you, so if you can unmute.
Sorry, I muted myself. I said absolutely. It is right there. And it is signed.
So, Roberto, let's first ask a personal question. You had a son who had the virus. How's he doing?
He tested negative second time around after a 14-day quarantine, and he's okay now. So thank you for asking that. But it did put us very close and personal to this whole situation, and thankfully he's out of it. But
so Roberto, let me ask you a question. Maybe you can be more upbeat and tell us that is it possible that the coronavirus strikes Maduro and Obrador and some of these other authoritarians so we can get, is that the best hope that we can get? How is it possible that a country that is the wealthiest country in all of Latin America, resource-based, Venezuela, can turn communist in a total collapse, and yet they stay in power? How is that possible? Isn't that kind of a scary scenario for Mexico and other Latin American countries?
Well, that's a very good question, Mark. And indeed, I think this question is independent of what COVID-19 did, because what COVID-19 and the lockdowns did in Venezuela could be the equivalent of a catastrophe over yet another catastrophe. You already had hyperinflation in an age of deflationary expectations. You already had over 80% of the population in poverty. You already had a hemorrhage of human capital and of families trying to flee the country at absolutely all costs. How he retains power, and especially after being branded as a narco-terrorist by the Trump administration, as well he should, how he retains power has been one of the greatest mysteries to date. Especially as far as the military and political lockdown that he has, and clearly a far less more popularity than one would expect. But in any case, Venezuela has suffered perhaps less comparatively than other countries because it had very little trade and it had very little interaction with the rest of the world. But we don't know what the figures are as far as the COVID-19 infections and as far as the economic effect. We do know that Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Argentina seem to be catastrophes over catastrophes. And perhaps that's the best that we could hope for. Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil is the only leader that has gotten infected so far. But here you have a situation where some people have said that this is the equivalent or the 21st century version of the lost decade of the 1980s in Latin America. It is arguably perhaps worse, with one exception. The reason is that Latin America always seemed to have an escape valve or an escape route or a miraculous way out. In the 1990s, it was the hyper commodity boom, the high commodity prices that functioned as a type of economic morphine or financial morphine for all the idiocies that were done in Argentina and Venezuela and in many other such countries. You also have the informal economy, the so-called informal economy that Hernando de Soto has written so much about, and many others. The informal economy is no longer there as a mechanism to try and mitigate the tremendous economic damage on the demand side and on the supply side that these lockdowns have generated, and the sudden stop in all types, virtually all types of investments. Remittances are perhaps the only lifeline that Latin America countries have right now, but those are also potentially going to dry out because there's so much that can be sent from Europe, from the United States, from Canada, and from other developed nations. And finally,
Roberto, let me ask you very quickly, isn't the border closed between Mexico and the United States? Is it, you couldn't even come to FreedomFest even if you wanted to. What is
I would have to go into 14-day quarantine, which of course 14 days in Las Vegas is not precisely something one would shy about, but 14 days in a room. Indeed, it has just been announced that the closure of the border for non-essential travel will continue until the end of August, and that has absolutely decimated the Mexican economy. I was going to say about the Mexican economy precisely that contrary to all of Latin America, this is perhaps the only potential ray of hope that could emerge, because Mexico, thanks to trade integration with the rest of the world and especially North America, has been able to develop all these supply chains and has been able to develop a service sector, a tremendous manufacturing sector, and tremendous economic inertia with Canada and the United States that thankfully is now going to continue under the newly implemented USMCA. Unfortunately, with López Obrador in Mexico, he's following all the wrong policies. It is almost like common sense has been lost with COVID-19 and adopting all kinds of toxic policies that pretend to actually block productive investment from coming in, sending all the wrong signals. So I think Latin America is indeed for a very, very difficult scenario. I do retain hope that some common sense will be practiced in some countries, because this is truly a coming to terms with reality and what can countries do as far as adopting the right institutional arrangements in order to be able to get ahead in the face of such a dramatic crisis.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Roberto, for that quick assessment of Latin America. Maybe Sweden is the only country that's in good, decent financial shape. We switch now to China.
Let me add to that. Mark, let me just add to that. I think the Swedish model is the only model we can follow looking forward in Latin America and perhaps the rest of the world. Whether you like it or not, and whether there are more deaths or not, it is the only model, because otherwise the economic asphyxiation will simply drown us in a far greater depression than even Nubel Rubini would imagine.
So, Barbara, you're in agreement with that, I presume. The Swedish model is replaced the Austrian school of economics. It's now the Swedish school of economics.
Swedish school of economics. No, but to be honest, what is very important, and what I forgot to mention before, we have to go back to productivity, because what we've seen in Europe, especially Germany, Austria, and all those other countries where people stayed at home, were forced to stay at home and are not allowed to work, that productivity levels totally drop, and people are not used to work anymore, even if they are allowed to come back to their offices. So this is something that we have to look at and be very careful about. And especially in countries where you have this so-called entitlement principle, where you get the money kind of for free, as you all know, or what they discuss, we have to be very careful. So productivity is the key to go back to normal.
Mark, let me just add one quick thing to this, and I know you want to, but I believe that the lockdown of the American economy will go down as one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the United States. There is no question. I mean, I think that the cost of the lockdowns are multiple times higher, not like 30% higher, multiple times higher than any benefit. And I'd also make the case, and I think that this is starting to come through in the data, that the health damage that we've done to the American people by locking them up, imprisoning them for 3 months, for children, disaster, for workers. I had been saying for weeks that we were going to have rioting in the streets. The rioting in the streets that we're seeing in the United States has nothing to do with racial. This was just a tinderbox that we had created of rage by people who, you can't keep 18 to 30-year-old males locked in their houses with nothing to do, no job to go to, no income, and expect anything but a complete combustible engine. So both from a health perspective and an economic perspective, it was a complete catastrophe. And we have the evidence from the states, Mark, that the states that did not lock down their economies saw about 1/10 the death rates of the states that did lock down their economies. There's zero evidence in the United States that lockdowns reduced rates or deaths.
Yeah, very good point. So now let's...
You can see from the figures, and I quoted those before, how much harm is done to the economy. 0.5% every 2 weeks minus.
Yeah, no, it's really a disaster. So let's go to Lee Schooland. Looks like we can all blame China for this, right?
Yes, definitely.
You guys got it started, but it's really valuable, Lee, to find out where we are in incredible executive powers. We've lost a lot of freedom. Tell us what is happening in China. Let's start with Hong Kong, with the dissidents in Hong Kong. Is Hong Kong lost now as a free economy? Is that over? Is China basically taking over Hong Kong completely? What's your perspective on the on Hong Kong? And then let's talk about China.
Yes, Hong Kong actually right now is Xi Jinping's strategy to divert the attention. So when he does this in Hong Kong, and then the world forget about his other policies. And even though the world followed him by locking down the country, the economy, he already won. Xi Jinping won big this time. There's no, like other panelists just mentioned, there's no evidence this method works, but because Xi Jinping did it, because China did it, the whole world followed except Sweden. And then Chinese people is very upset with the government right now, and the economy was really, really bad. So by diverting the attention, he first raised war with United States, and then with India, and now Hong Kong. Because Xi Jinping, he doesn't understand economics. He believes he can dictate people's needs and wants. And he thought China doesn't need Hong Kong. He didn't know Hong Kong, because the rule of law is embedded in Hong Kong for 100 years. That's why there's prosperity. He thought we have Shenzhen already. We have the same similar infrastructure. We don't need Hong Kong. So we can sacrifice Hong Kong. Actually, this is so wrong, but he did it. Because the world, he take advantage of the world focusing on their own domestic problems, issues. So very few country did much to stop Xi Jinping. And also there are about 60 some countries, 1/3 of the world supported Xi Jinping, because he has been paying off these countries for the past, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years. And so he got some support so he could do it. Hong Kong is lost, but actually China lost bigger, because the financial center is no longer going to be there. There's no trust, because no rule of law. Nobody will trust that their investment will be safe, will be protected. Their business will be protected. U.S. Embassy is selling their buildings, and that's very obvious. People are leaving.
What about, Lee, what about dissidents? What about persecution of religious believers? Have you been able to go into China? Are you safe to go into China? Can you still travel to China? What about dissidents and the surveillance state that is existing in China, kind of setting the standard for the rest of the world?
I'm not sure. That's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm still safe to go back to China. I was in China last year this time for more than a month. I led a group of Austrian economists, toured 12 cities in China and talking about free market economics. And I know I'm watched. Right now with this, you know, they were warning me about my Facebook postings by friends. And because they saw others was talking about it, they told me, could you please take it down, what you said about Hong Kong and my interview with Matt Kibbe. So I pulled some strings with my friends in the high position to, you know, make it not as a big issue as it should, they want it to be. So, but still, I don't know. This year, I didn't go to China yet. I'm not going to, because China blocked all the foreigners to going to China, and I don't know. China also controlled everybody by controlling their bank account. Everybody's personal bank account is controlled by the government. I remember trying to withdraw $200 cash last year, and I have to make appointment 4 days ahead of time. And I could only take $200, nothing more than that. Right now, it's nobody can send money into China, and nobody can send money out of China. They are totally controlling personal account because there's no cash in any banks. No cash.
Wow. Well, listen, we unfortunately we've run out of time. I want to thank our panel. This Global Economic Summit is such an important part of Freedom Fest. I'm glad our attendees got a chance to see how important this is. Did anybody want to make one final statement, Lee, or anything? I cut you off a little bit. So was there any other point you wanted to make before we close?
Yeah, the sensitive things for everybody to watch is the relationship between Xi Jinping and the Premier Li Keqiang. He is he understood economics. So about 2 months ago, he called to open the sidewalk economy to help people to find their own livelihood by market economy in a small scale. And Xi Jinping crushed it down. And then he told the world 40% of Chinese are living under $140 a month. And Xi Jinping also lost faith in that because he claimed that China is becoming world economic power and everybody will become middle class. And then Li Keqiang said the truth is 40% Chinese live at less than $140 a month. So the relationship's really sensitive. And so we are very happy to see if Li Keqiang win, Xi Jinping will be gone. So watch that.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate Lee, Barbara, Roberto, and Steve. This has been really valuable information. I thank you all. Coming up is our next panel is going to be talking about the November election. Steve mentioned that he thought that that's going to be a real fight and that Trump will win in the end. He's going to come from behind again. So we will see if that's the case. Otherwise, we may end up like Obrador in Mexico and with Biden. So, all right. Well, thank you again. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next year at Freedom Fest. Thank you.
Yes, definitely, for sure. Back to normal. Bye.
See. Take care. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are now into our third panel. We have had a panel on the new normal. That was our first panel about what kind of permanent changes are being made in the in culture, in the economy, and politics. And then after that, we had the Global Economic Summit covering what's going on in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and China. And now we come to the pandemic election. What can we expect in November? And we have three great panelists. We have Grover Norquist, we have John Fund, and we have Nick Gillespie from Reason. So let's get started by getting John Fund's reaction to Steve Moore, who in the previous panel said that it is going to be a dogfight in November, but Trump will pull it off. What is your reaction to that prediction, John?
Well, any prediction at this point, 115 odd days out, is possible. Lots can happen in the space of that time. If the election were held today, Donald Trump would lose. If the election were held today, the Republicans would lose the Senate. But the election is not held today. And three things that can happen between now and November that are at least conceivable are as follows. One is that despite a great deal of concern and uncertainty on the part of the public, I have many friends who are still scared or unsure about venturing out to contact with other human beings. The economy picks up. As we know, the economy wasn't destroyed. It was put into a slumber, a coma by government. And if we can avoid having the extension of the unemployment benefits, which meant that many of the people who were furloughed were earning more staying home than if they had gone back to work, I think the economy will be in better shape. The second thing that can happen between now and November is that Joe Biden's basement strategy, his storm dweller strategy, doesn't fully work. He comes out and he doesn't appear to be fully lucid or in charge, and that creates a competence question. I've often said that this race may turn out to be crazy versus senile, and that may be the choice the American people have, which is why some people are going to vote third party.
But John, isn't Trump crazy as a fox? Isn't that what they say?
I would say Trump was crazy as a fox 4 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. He's Rain Man. I mean, there are about 5 things in politics that he does more brilliantly than anything I've ever seen: branding, marketing, pinning labels on your opponents. But I'll be honest with you, Joe Biden has definitely slowed down the last few years. So too is Donald Trump, in the fact that his attention span is even shorter than it used to be, and he's more erratic. He changes his mind even more frequently than he used to. So crazy like a fox at one point, maybe just a little bit more unpredictably crazy now.
So Grover, Joe Biden just came out with his 10-point tax plan. Since you are ahead of the Americans for Tax Reform, I guess he's not going to be signing your no tax increase pledge, right? But have you looked at how incredibly, I mean, I just couldn't believe it. No breaks for capital gains. You end up this elimination of the stepped up basis, raising the corporate tax rate. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. What was your assessment of this tax plan?
A 58% increase in the corporate tax rate.
Jeez.
What, interestingly, if you want to take the argument that Trump is cleverer than we think, by making all these ridiculous mistakes and unforced errors for the first 6 months of this year, he tricked the other team into thinking they could show their colors before November and still after, instead of after November, which is what Clinton did and Obama did. So Biden came out, and if he is called to account on his tax policy, he can't win. He wants to take the corporate rate from 21% to 28. Sometimes he says 35, but 28 is the lowest he's gone. In all cases, he would tax American companies more highly than those same companies if they moved to China, which is 25. Add to that he wants to take the capital gains tax, not just for the rich, but as he has said, for every single American, to 40% for all Americans, not just rich people, all Americans. So his tax policies called for an energy tax, which is an endless, limitless tax on consumption of all products of all times, because there's energy in everything. Imagine how Americans react. You don't have to imagine. You know how Americans react to a gas tax. How will they react to a national energy tax, which is a gas tax, gasoline tax on steroids? All of your energy use to be there. For a family of 4, you take the earning $73,000 median income for a family of 4. It's a $2,000 tax increase to get rid of the tax, the Trump tax cuts. Biden said that he would bring back the tax, the Obamacare tax, the penalty tax, to punish you if you don't buy Obamacare like you're supposed to. Before Trump rescued people and the Republicans rescued people, 5 million Americans were hit with a tax of $700 per person or $2,000 for family of 4 for getting nothing. You didn't get Obamacare for that. That was the penalty for not buying Obamacare, because it made no economic sense to you. 3/4 of those people made less than $50,000 a year. So Biden's taxes on low-income people are pretty rough. His taxes on investment and capital are pretty rough. I would suggest that of the 80 million households that have a 401k or IRA in this country, it's more than 80 million people, but 80 million households that have one or two of those. If they look at their 401k when Biden was vice president on election day and compare it to how high up it went once, and then after COVID a second time, they would notice one thing. Their 401k IRA was more valuable at the bottom of the COVID recession than on election day when Biden and Obama's economic policies were in place. COVID was worse for your life savings temporarily than the Obamacare people after 7 years. So there's not just a couple $1,000s that a middle-class person would lose if Biden won, plus their taxes on energy, but it is their life savings would collapse substantially and in the long term. You can win an election with that if you don't talk about other silly things and get distracted.
So maybe Nick Gillespie, you can tell us about not the tax, for the taxpayer's point of view, it's pretty negative, but in terms of benefits, you're talking about free education, you're talking about Medicare for all, you're talking about universal income. I mean, he has a lot of the Green New Deal. To what extent are we going to see higher taxes and higher spending on top of it? How do you see the Biden and the Democrats?
Look, you know, I'll preface my opening set of comments with the fact that I won't be voting for Donald Trump and I won't be voting for Joe Biden. I'll probably vote for Joe Jorgensen, but even that's not a done deal yet. I would prefer to see Donald Trump win in November, because at this point, the only thing that the Republicans have going for them, or the presidency, is a divided government. Donald Trump has been about the most disastrous president of the 21st century. And given that his only competition is Obama and George W. Bush, that's saying something. I suspect Biden, with a unified Democratic Party, at least for 2 years, could conceivably be worse and create a backlash in the midterms of 2022. But we should be focusing specifically from a libertarian perspective on the fact that Donald Trump's presidency has largely been a disaster. When you look at issues like immigration and free trade, and then his tax policy, tax and spend policy. Trump spending has increased vastly under Trump before coronavirus. It has gone catastrophic. Talk about spending on steroids. All of this has to be paid for. And as John was alluding to early on, Trump seemed to be crazy like a fox, maybe. Now he's kind of like a rabid fox. Nobody has any idea what's going on. And we can talk about how awful a Joe Biden presidency, if he got all of his everything he wanted on his wish list to be done, it would be terrible. But first, we should do an accounting of how terrible Donald Trump has been. There are a few things that he's been good on. Most of the big picture items and the long-term trajectory stuff has been terrible. And I think we should focus on that before we start talking about what a horrible, horrible president Joe Biden will be.
The two arguments, and John and Grover, you can jump in on this, is that Trump gave us some good tax relief and reduced the corporate tax rate. And also he chose some constitutionalist type of judges. Those are the two arguments that have been made. Evangelicals are very positive about his anti-abortion stand and stuff like that. But those are the two main ones. John, is there anything else that Trump has done that you would say is a good thing and we need to continue on? Or is he just a big spending Republican who plays that game? Even Reagan played that game, didn't he? He lowered taxes, but he kept spending.
Well, it is true that Ronald Reagan had a Democratic House of Representatives the entire time that he was in office, and one branch of Congress can veto or block any president's initiatives. With Donald Trump, I would add a third silver lining, which is regulation. Regulation has been pared back in many areas, not as much as it should be, not as much as perhaps our dream president would have it. But in every area that I can look at, whether it's public lands whether it's energy development, especially with public lands, and certainly with a lot of regulatory policy when it comes to the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC. I'd give you the net neutrality order. There's been a lot of improvement. Now, the reason we've had that improvement is unusual. Donald Trump is interested in only a few things. If there's one thing that he's been consistent on, this is per Nick's observation, for 30 years he has had a position on free trade which is opposed to much of the world's interdependence. And I certainly share with Donald Trump his disdain for a lot of these multilateral trade organizations. I think the World Trade Organization admitting China into its membership ultimately has proven itself a disaster because the Chinese don't know how to play by the rules. But Donald Trump has been a consistent anti-free trader. The things that he's not interested in would fill several volumes. And in there, Donald Trump is so uninterested in them that he has delegated those areas to people who have all kinds of interest in them and have studied them carefully. Leonard Leo when it comes to judges of the Federalist Society. Naomi Rao, before she went on the DC Circuit Court, was in charge of regulatory policy, the OIRA office at OMB. And in where Donald Trump has had no interest in government, we actually are getting some less government or a reduction in the growth of government. I just wish that Donald Trump in some places would be even less interested in the inner workings of government.
I think the issue of immigration has to be front and center. Again, I'm saying this from a libertarian point of view, a small L libertarian. I'm not even a member of the Libertarian Party, but his immigration policies are not just simply ruinous to the economy. I think they go to the very fiber of America as a land of immigrants and as a place that prides freedom, not just of people to move, freedom of movement, but also of businesses to hire who they think is best. Trump has been terrible on that. He's been good, as John was saying, on some regulatory issues. He is by far and away the best criminal justice reform president we've had. But you can't get away from the fact that he signed off on tax cuts and signed off on massive increases in spending. Earlier this year, the New York Times tallied up, he was spending since Trump has been elected, and this is before all the coronavirus stuff happened, which puts it into a whole other galaxy. But individuals he was spending about $1,441 per capita more, as of January 1st, than when he took office. Those are increases that are on the order of magnitude of somebody like George Bush, who increased spending by 50% in inflation-adjusted terms in 8 years, and what Obama did, where there was a massive spike and then a flattening. And again, I'm not saying this means that Joe Biden should be coronated president or we should have anything good to say about Joe Biden, but libertarians in particular, who are part of a Republican, to the extent that we're part of a Republican alliance, we need to stand up at some point and say, we're not going to go along with the Republican mantras that any Republican, no matter what, is better than anything else, especially when you have a Republican Congress, which under Bush, under Obama, under Trump, Republicans have done nothing virtually to limit the size, scope, and spending of government. And that should be, we need to threaten the Republican Party that if they ever want to hold office, certainly at the national level, but at every other level, they've really got to start hewing to, a small government philosophy that you don't even hear them articulating anymore, because they want troops at the border to keep the Mexicans out, and they want to keep Chinese goods out and things like that. This is not a libertarian-friendly Republican Party. Trump, again, better than Biden, I think, but really needs to be held to account.
So let me ask you a question. It sounds to me the best we can hope for is some kind of gridlock to keep things unraveling even more. And what is the chances of gridlock? John, you already mentioned the possibility that, the Senate and the House could go Democrat, but you could keep the president in there, and that would create the gridlock environment. How is it that the Republicans have basically given up on the Senate as well? It sounds like they, in the last, no. So can they win keep control of the Senate? Grover, you're shaking your head. John?
I'm shaking. The left's making the argument that they're going to take the Senate, just as they went after Dole about this time of the year, explaining that Dole couldn't win in 96. It's very important to the left to make people collapse on center-right in order to think that they will lose the Senate. The Senate is very much in contest. It would help if Trump would get his numbers up a little bit. I think we should all take comfort from Nick's points, which are make a list of the things that Trump has done that are non-Reagan Republican, non-libertarian, trade, the restrictions. The value of our tax cut was damaged when you saw it coming rushing out, great tax cut, all sorts of growth, turn around, hit China with tariffs. Tariffs are taxes, tariffs are taxes, tariffs are taxes. The tariff on tea was a tax. And you saw the economy slow. Why? Not because the tax cut didn't work, but because you got a tax cut and you had these huge tariffs. You had pepperoni pizza and shards of glass. The problem wasn't the pepperoni, it was the shards of glass. And it is important, win, lose, or draw, that we explain vote winning issues are cut people's taxes, give them more freedom. Vote winning issues are recognizing that immigrants are like gold. In the old days, people used to go on boats to get gold and steal it from other countries. Talent is the new gold. It's the new oil. And people are willing to they're willing to pay their own way to bring this value to the United States. And we have idiot politicians going, no, don't be trying to trick us by coming and inventing things here. You must go back to India and invent something there. And then we'll whine about outsourcing. What has hurt the economy has been tariffs and the anti-immigrant efforts, both at the high and low end of the pay scale and of the talent pool. You could just look at the data, and this is clear. And also the politics of those issues suck. Being anti-immigrant does not win you a vote that Trump didn't already have when he raised his hand and said, I'm not one of the crazy Democrats. There with you. So we got to fight this fight, and we need to make it very clear what helped Trump and what hurt him. And the good news is, it's all the anti-libertarian, anti-Reagan Republican positions he's taken that he's bleeding as he goes forward in this election. It's all self-imposed damage.
So, John, we have our friend Larry Kudlow, who's the chief economic advisor to the president. Does he have no influence? Is it all Navarro and these people that are protectionist and so forth? What's happening in the White House? You know these people. Are they? I mean, it's frustrating.
Well, there's BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID. COVID has changed the economic debate in dramatic fashion. As has been referenced earlier, an expansion of government and the stimulus spending programs that had never been seen before, even during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. So we're struggling to get back to the sound economic policies in many areas that we had before March. And I certainly agree with Nick that the debt is a long-term issue. But right in the here and now, COVID is dominating everything. And we're into damage control. If we can control enough of the damage that was done by the lockdown, which was, I think all of us can agree, a highly dubious proposition, the first time in recorded history that we failed to protect the most vulnerable of our populations in nursing homes and managed to lock up the healthy populations in their own homes. If we can contain the damage of that, we can start to restore some of the economic vigor that we had. And we were doing a pretty good job of getting people employed, especially in minority communities, and doing a pretty good job of even increasing productivity and even finally tackling the workforce participation rates, which have been going down for a long time. We're finally ticking up.
Yeah, I think one of the final issues that concerns me is that normally when 40 million people are unemployed, they kick the whoever's in charge, whether it's governors or presidents or House of Representatives or senators, there's a tendency to just kick them all out. And yet I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing actually that these people are going to get reelected. I mean, are we going to see real change where people saying, you know, I was really fed up by your overreaction to the lockdown and so on? Or are they going to say, no, the government was great because they sent me a lot of money? Nick?
I think it's the latter, and this is John alluded to it. The federal enhancement on unemployment benefits to the tune of about $600 a week are supposed to end at the end of July. Something will replace them. It might not be as much. It might be as much. I doubt it would be more. But I think that's a huge question, and what kind of effect and who pays a political price for that. We've managed to create the most bizarre world imaginable, where massive numbers of people, tens of millions of people, are out of work, and household income tends to increase because of a variety of things, and household savings have increased because there's nothing to spend it on. We're in uncharted territory here, and what I would love to hear from either Trump or Biden, and I don't think we're going to get this, is a kind of rationale for what's going on and what can we do going forward. The national debt, and you know, I hate to be on a kind of very libertarian hobby horse here. It is not a long-term issue. It would have been 20 years ago, but we have been in persistent high national debts that market economists like Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart and Vincent Reinhart have identified as, when you carry the amount of national debt that we have for the length that we have without any credible gesture towards reducing it, you reduce future economic growth by 50%, from 3% to 2% a year or less annually. That's what we've seen almost the entirety of the 21st century. And neither Trump nor Biden has even addressed that issue, much less put into place some way to right-size that. And I think without that, at best, we're going to be seeing 1%, maybe 2% economic growth. And that helps to explain why we're all chewing each other's legs off, why, you know, racial politics, ethnic politics, regional politics, immigrant versus native politics, all of this stuff is coming to the fore because we have an economy that is barely moving. And people want to, you know, we have a pie that is not growing, and people are starting to want a bigger and bigger piece for themselves.
Grover, Grover, you have the last word. Go ahead, Grover.
Well, here's the missed opportunity. If some idiot hadn't thrown away a perfectly good Senate seat in Alabama a few years ago, the Trump administration, Cohen, the chief economic guy there before Kudlow, the plan was in year 2 to do the Ryan plan, which is to take all of the means-tested programs, or at least the 4 largest ones that are the bulk of them, and block grant them to the states and limit their growth to inflation. If you do that, that bends down the cost of entitlements. You'll have to deal with Social Security and Medicare, but those, you can set that aside and focus on Medicaid, and all of the others would have been a tremendous automatic pilot reduction in spending as a percent of GDP out of the federal government. And we were this close to getting that, which is why, and this is with Trump, and this is with Trump's more liberal advisors on how to handle things. We have to get entitlement reform. That's what we need. And that's the argument for a Republican House, Senate, and presidency. But enough senators, so you couldn't count on McCain because he'd stab you in the back, and you couldn't count on Alaska, and when you lost Alabama, you just didn't have the votes there. So if you had 51 real votes, you can do entitlement reform with Trump, with a Republican House of any structure. That's what's between us and what Nick was pointing out, which is seriously stronger growth on a regular basis going forward. We have to fix that ASAP.
Mark, if I can just say, you know, this in an election, I'm sure that neither candidate will get more than 50% of the vote. Every vote matters. This is a moment for small L libertarians to really kind of flex and make what we want known, because both the Republicans and the Democrats, and obviously we have more influence in the Republican Party, need every vote. And if we want a government that spends less and does less and costs less, you know, this is the moment to really make our voices heard. And I think we can have an effect on, you know, not just this election, but hopefully the next 4 years and the elections after that.
John, I'll give you the last word because you are an expert on voter fraud. Are we going to see the highest level of voter fraud with these ballot harvesting and Are we even going to see results on November 4th, or is it going to be a week or 2 weeks before we find out who's running the government? Your last word, please. We've got 1 minute.
It's impossible to deal with that in 1 minute. I'm sorry.
I will. No, we're not going to see voter fraud. Voter fraud is not an issue. This is the argument to be having.
You got me going. Of course, it's an issue. Mail-in voting is not absentee voting as we grew up with. It's what you grew up with, Nick. Mail-in voting is a complete subversion of the process, because what people want to do is mail to every registered voter, regardless of whether they've ever voted. And that's a recipe for complete chaos, because the ballots are outside the jurisdiction of election officials. And as for counting the votes, the one thing in life we've done more poorly at in the last 30 years is counting votes. We used to be able to count votes and actually know about them the next morning. Now we are going to have election month after election day. And as soon as people cast their ballots, we're going to turn over, if the result is at all close, we're going to turn over everything to the election lawyers. We're going to see Florida 2020 instead of Florida 2000, except it's going to be in all 50 states. So pardon me, you've raised my ire, because this is my wheelhouse.
Right at the end of our panel.
If you want me to write an article for Reason, I'll be happy to do it.
Okay, well, thank you. With that, we have to close, unfortunately, because we have one more panel, our upcoming panel, the future of business and the markets, which are hitting all-time highs, including gold. Where is that going to lead us? Anyway, Grover, John, Nick, thank you all very much for great material for our emergency meeting. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. We're now in our fourth and final panel of the emergency meeting here on July 13th. I'm here in Las Vegas. We were expecting, of course, 1,500 people or more for our FreedomFest conference. Catch the Vision was our theme, but unfortunately, because of the imperial governor of Nevada, we were shut down. And so at least we're doing this virtual emergency meeting, and we're very excited about our group. And I want to thank in particular our staff. They have just done a wonderful job. Valerie and Matt and Autumn and Nathan and Haley and Joanne, my wife, doing the Anthem Film Festival. And by the way, Joanne will be doing, we will have another version of a virtual version or online version of the Anthem Film Festival, so that the 30-some films that she selected, we can see at least most of those. So we'll have some information on that. But meanwhile, I want to welcome our final panel. We have Steve Forbes of Forbes Magazine and Forbes Inc. We have Alex Green, with the Oxford Club, the chief strategist, investment strategist for the Oxford Club, a longtime friend. And we have a newcomer, Jonathan Ward, who is the author of China's Vision of Victory, a fantastic, fascinating book. And he is he's a consultant to a wide variety of people and institutions around the world. We're delighted to have him here to particularly talk about China and maybe Russia. Maybe we can broaden it to India and a few other areas as well. So let me start off by asking, first of all, one of the most exciting things, considering all the bad news that we've heard about over the last three panels, the stock market is at an all-time high. If you look at the NASDAQ, maybe even the S&P 500, I know the Dow is not quite there, but are investors delusional that we're headed for massive deficits? We're facing the possibility, the Democrats taking over in office. Steve, Mr. Forbes, what's your opinion? Is the stock market just really not seeing reality the way we should, or what's your view on the stock market and the outlook for the economy and the markets?
Well, putting aside technical factors like the Federal Reserve suppressing interest rates and dumb things like that make the stock market the only place you can place money, the market is booming, especially NASDAQ, precisely because those tech companies have shown great resilience throughout this crisis, great innovation. And as you know, Mark, the stocks try to anticipate the future. And if we don't muck up in the November elections, this economy is ready to roar. We saw that before the COVID crisis hit in February. Record low unemployment. Investing was starting to pick up, especially after we got these trade disputes out of the way late last year, or at least put them on the back burner. Investing was going up. The economy was moving right ahead. And low-income workers, their salaries, their wages were starting to move up faster than the people in other brackets. So things were going well. And the market figures, if we get that kind of environment, good things will happen again. But I do think that you should be cautious, because we do have the fact that Democrats might win. They might win the White House and they might win the Senate. And Joe Biden, in a speech the other day, I'm surprised they allowed him to give it, Mark, he outlined higher taxes, more regulations, denounced what he called stock market capitalism, as if 100 million Americans in 401ks don't count. And you get the kind of things they would do, putting restrictions on businesses, raising burdens on individuals and businesses, bad stuff. So the market's anticipating that those bad things won't happen, but I would be a little bit cautious on that. For your retirement plans, yes, continue to make those contributions on a systematic basis. But on other parts of your portfolio, even though the market seems to be heading higher and higher, I would be cautious, because bad things can happen.
Thank you. And let's go to Alex Green, who makes his entire career on the markets and has done a fantastic job beating the market year after year with the Oxford Club. Very impressive. So tell us, will the stock market crash when Biden gets elected in November?
I don't think so. And first of all, it's of course, we don't know that Biden is going to be elected. And if he is elected, we don't know if we'll have a Democratic Senate. You know, if Biden is elected, but the Senate stays in Republican hands, he's not going to be able to pass the far left agenda. So they would block the worst excesses of the radical left. But I think the reason the stock market is actually acting rationally is, while the media is focused on the rising number of COVID cases, stock market investors are looking out 6 to 9 months, which puts us somewhere late winter next spring. And what their investors are seeing is, with the massive fiscal stimulus and the unlimited central bank liquidity and the rock bottom interest rates and the ultra cheap energy, and the fact that we've got good success in treating COVID with antibodies, and there are 3 companies, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, who are in phase 3 trials now for a vaccine that will almost certainly be available later this year, at least one vaccine for emergency authorization. And beyond that, we'll have widespread immunization and eventually herd immunity. So all the stock market is doing is looking beyond today's headlines and saying that things really should be pretty good 6 to 9 months out. I'm not a political forecaster, so I can't tell you what's going to happen in November, but I can say that right now, with interest rates so low, they don't offer any kind of a competition for stocks, because both bonds and money markets yield next to nothing. And so people are saying, hey, if I'm going to earn any kind of return at all, it's going to have to be in the stock market.
So, Jonathan, I'd like to turn now, because China is viewed as a threat in many ways. I mean, Steve Forbes mentioned that you got to be cautious, because there are these black swan events that can occur. And you have written a very provocative book, China's Vision of Victory. Let me preface my question by saying we all thought that Russia was a threat, military threat, economic threat. That proved to be in some ways a paper tiger, and the communism collapsed, if you will, except in Venezuela. And in China, you still have the communists in control in China. We all thought Japan was going to be an economic threat to the United States, and yet they have never recovered fully from their collapse in the early 90s. Is China then now a little bit of a false threat that we really don't need to worry about China? What is your concerns? What are your fears about China in the international and economic arena?
Well, this is on a totally different scale than anything we've done before. And the reason is that China has successfully pushed ahead in building economic power on a scale that the USSR did not have, on a scale that Japan was not able to complete. And ultimately, they're doing this in service of a strategic vision that they call the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And it's really this long-term program of becoming the dominant superpower in world affairs. And China's vision of victory, of course, lays this out all in their own words. I mean, that's what I was working on for years, was understanding their strategy, their statements, their vision, all in their own words, not really a matter of opinion so much as their opinion. I mean, where do they think this is going, China's leaders? And I put that all together in the book so anyone can have access to it. But it's quite a comprehensive vision. And I think we also have to remember the enormous level of effort that went into actually vanquishing the USSR, or to actually reestablishing economic policy in such a way that Japan could not, overmatch us in the semiconductors industry, for instance. I mean, this has taken a great deal of US counterpoint to wind up in the position that we've been in for so many years. So I think we have to take China seriously. We have to begin by understanding it. And we also have to remember that this is fundamentally about the economic competition. The only way to turn this competition, the only way for America to win, is for us to remain the top economy and to use that to resource a global strategy. If we begin to wane and sort of decline, so to speak, relative to China's economic position, then we will have far greater challenges than we have today. And part of why this matters is because I think America's CEOs and business leaders are not yet getting this message. They're still looking at China as a billion-person market. I think relatively few have really assessed their China exposure and their China problem. And it's going to put them in the crosshairs of a US national security strategy that ultimately has to go ahead to prevent China from becoming the dominant power. We need our CEOs to be working with the US national interest in order to defeat this challenger. So that's going to be a big change. All our companies are on the front lines.
It seems, Jonathan, that we have, Steve, did you want to make a comment on that?
Well, one of the things that happened, Mark, in 2008, the crisis of 2008 really shook China up. They drew the conclusion from 2008 that the U.S. really didn't know how to do an economy, that free markets don't work, and that the U.S. was a declining power. And that's why they have this notion today they are going to be triumphant. And that's why we have to do again what we did in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, get the U.S. economy booming and show that our way is better than their way. Not only create resources, but show the world government domination does not ultimately triumph.
So, Jonathan, I'm curious, how does the Chinese view with the COVID-19? They've been able to, we don't say the Asian flu anymore, or the Wuhan. It's considered racist to even make those kinds of comments. Have they done a good job of not taking the blame for the total collapse of the global economy and so on? What is China's view regarding this whole COVID crisis? Do they say we've come out on top, we've solved the problem, and you haven't? How do they see that?
There's this concept in Communist Party strategic thinking, the Communist Party of China, called turning crisis into opportunity. And I think that's something that I've seen go by quite a lot in current sort of reflections on COVID from the Chinese side. And it's this idea, they had this concept of the period of strategic opportunity, where they would basically have the year of 2000 to 2020, and the world would not catch on to them as a dangerous or hostile power. And then ultimately, eventually, they take the gloves off. And now there's this question of, what's the nature of the opportunity in COVID? And certainly you can see them pressing on all fronts in their region, from the Himalayan borders where they've killed Indian soldiers to, invading Taiwanese airspace to harassing Japan. Certainly the war of words with the United States. By the time they're calling the Secretary of State an enemy of mankind. I mean, this is really a relationship that's deteriorating with all their neighbors, and yet I don't think we've even begun to hold them accountable for COVID-19. I mean, this has killed 500,000 people worldwide. It's added trillions to our national debt. It's put our economy, our education system, all of this into crisis, and it's fundamentally a very big blow to the United States right now in a period in which China sees us as their prime competitor and one that they aim to surpass in every instrument of national power. So clearly they see themselves as taking advantage of this, and we have to be ready to reposition and come out very strong when we get through this crisis.
So do you think that's possible, Alex, that we can come back strong, a V-shaped recovery like the stock market, or are we saddling ourselves with so much debt, with so many new government programs? I mean, if you look at Biden's proposals, he outspends Trump, and Trump has been spending money like crazy. So can you give us an optimistic vision where the United States can stand up to China?
Well, I think people who have access to good information worldwide realize that the virus originated in China, that China's authoritarian government did not do a good job of containing it, and it is responsible for the havoc that it's wreaked all over the world. But I think back to remember when Reagan was president and the Russians shot down the Korean commercial airliner by mistake, and everybody asked Reagan what he was going to do about it, and he eventually said, "You know what we're going to do? We're not going to do anything because the world will judge what the Russians have done here." And I think the world is judging what China's done, but I just don't see how we can punish. I mean, we could certainly get into another trade war or something, but I just don't see how we could hold China accountable. They're doing propaganda of their own to say we're responsible or they're not responsible, but really it's sort of beside the point. I mean, I'm not a China expert, so I can't really speak with authority on that subject, but I will say, to your point about the massive debt we're running up, I don't think anybody thinks that it wasn't necessary to take the extreme steps, the trillions of dollars of deficit spending to pull us out of this. It would have been nice if we had handled our finances responsibly during the boom years when we didn't have to run trillion-dollar deficits, so that in an emergency like this we could spend. And I think the people who say that ultimately the debt just doesn't matter are not very good students of history, because if debt didn't matter, if you could just, because you can crank up the printing presses and pay it back, and if you don't have a technical default, then people would have run up debt for eons now, and really, you wouldn't even need to collect taxes. Debt doesn't matter. So I think there is a huge overhang looking out. At some point, no one knows when it'll be, that all this debt is going to have serious repercussions, but it's not going to happen now or 6 months from now or 9 months from now. But if we don't get the debt under control, there will be very serious consequences down the road.
You know, Alex, you and I we do investments, and one of our areas that both of us have gotten into is gold and gold investing. The stock market's doing great, but gold is really is surging, and actually has done very well in 2020, and now is moving up. Are you bullish on gold? Do you think gold has a really good play in your portfolio right now? Gold stocks as well?
Yeah, I do have some gold plays in my portfolio right now. Gold just hit an 11-year high. Certainly, if you're a short-term trader, you've got the wind at your back. And if you're a longer-term investor, you want to hedge both the uncertainty of how this whole coronavirus pandemic is going to play out and the massive deficit spending. You want to hold gold as some portion of your portfolio. I think people overdo it. I'm a great believer that equities are always going to deliver the best return after inflation over long periods of time. But gold can give fantastic performance in the short to medium term. And I think certainly if you look at a chart of gold right now, it's clear that the metal is headed higher.
Yeah. So, Steve, you've been a longtime advocate of a gold exchange standard. Are you bullish on gold right now?
I wouldn't call it bullish. I think the rising price of gold, which means the dollar's really ultimately going down in value, is a warning sign that the Federal Reserve does not know how to keep the dollar stable. In other words, we're going to have a bout of inflation. Whenever you have a weak dollar, Mark, whether it was in the 1970s or the early 2000s, it has a bad impact on the economy. So I'm very concerned about the rise. And this then gets to the whole way, how do we get out of the mess we're in today? And the answer is having right economic policies. We saw that in the 80s with massive tax cuts, deregulation, strong military defense, and we triumphed. And that's what we have to do now. The debt itself, I'm not concerned about the level of the debt itself, but about the economic environment. If we have that right environment like Reagan did, then we'll be able to grow our way to where that debt does not overwhelm us. Assets grow faster than liabilities. And that's the key. And one thing to look at, Mark, is what's going to happen in the next stimulus package. There will be one. Will that include a suspension for a year or so of the payroll tax, which would lower the cost of labor and lower the cost, enable workers to keep more of what they earn? Or are they going to do something crazy like increase or keep high unemployment benefits, which Casey Mulligan and Steve Moore pointed out will cost 8 to 10 million jobs because you earn far more not working than by working. So we'll see what they do in this stimulus package, whether they do good or whether they do harm.
It does seem that the, just eliminating for a certain period of time the payroll tax does smack of panic that we're in such trouble.
It's putting conditions in place to reduce the cost of hiring people and enabling workers to keep more of what they earn immediately. As you know, with the income tax, many people aren't liable for it, but with payroll taxes, every dollar you earn gets taxed, 15.3%, half employer, half employee. You suspend that, and that's good all around.
Yeah, no, I understand Social Security and Medicare as a way of putting money in everybody's pocket because everybody pays the payroll tax. I want to close on this whole, Jonathan, we'll start with you, this movement toward authoritarianism. I just finished reading a book on MSB in Saudi Arabia, the crown prince who's going to be the king probably for the next 40 years, very authoritarian in his approach and not necessarily friendly to the West. We have China with Xi being very much more authoritarian in the past. We have Maduro in Venezuela, who's still in power, even though he's creating hyperinflation. We have Donald Trump, who acts very much in an authoritarian way. These governors, everybody seems to be taking full advantage of executive powers. Are we seeing a new normal, if you will, where authoritarianism is the way of the future, or would democracy make a comeback?
I think looking at this in a global way, I mean, I think and in terms of history, I mean, I think you can look back over the last 100 years and look at it as the world's democracies wrestling with the world's authoritarians and dictatorships and totalitarians. And I think we are headed back into something like that. There is a certain argument to be made that we never really finished the job in the first Cold War. I mean, the same set of actors, Russia and China, other ancillary states like Cuba or Venezuela are still important in their way. But ultimately, I think the only way forward is for the democracies to come together to wage this competition with China. We're going to have to build our economic community. I mean, we're still 2/3 of global GDP. I mean, the world's democracies are 2/3 of that, and many of them are in a U.S. alliance system from the Atlantic to the Pacific. India's arrival on the world stage as an economically significant actor is going to be very important. I think you put India into a coalition of democracies, and you begin to see a great deal of power not only in the developed world but in the developing world. So I think this is where we have to be focused. I mean, we have to be building the U.S. economy. My question would be, how do we get to the next 10 trillion in U.S. GDP from 20 trillion now to 30 trillion by the end of the decade? And how do you unite the democracies into a trading community that is absolutely superior to what the authoritarians can bring together? But we do see the authoritarians coming together. I mean, Russia, China, Iran, that's it's happening.
So, Alex, do you see secular stagnation as a result of all this authoritarianism that's going on, that people are not free to pursue their own best interests, and entrepreneurship may be suppressed as a result? What do you see?
I don't really see entrepreneurship being suppressed. What really bothers me is the petty authoritarianism that you can't even speak certain points of view, certain opinions without falling afoul of the cancel culture. I was listening to Steven Pinker, a Harvard psychologist, the other day, saying that you can't go on a college campus and just state plainly that a capitalist economy is better than a Marxist economy without setting off an uproar. Or to say that the reason that young black men are disproportionately in jail is because they commit most of the violent crimes in this country. Or that more men are in science, engineering, and technology because they tend to be more attracted to those courses and go into those fields. And instead, you're called a racist, a sexist, a capitalist, which I enjoy being called. And so it's that type of authoritarianism that bothers me. I don't think all the claims about Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies, believe me, in a few months or in 4 years and a few months, he's going to be gone. And our democracy, our country will be none the worse off, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump. His authoritarian actions here have not done anything to make it harder to become entrepreneurial, harder to start a business. In fact, he's reduced regulations. He's reduced the corporate tax rate. He's done a lot of things to make it easier to be entrepreneurial. So yes, in certain countries overseas, there's it's surprising to me that there's a populist authoritarianism that's become popular. But in this country, it's the low level authoritarianism that bothers me, not the authoritarianism at the top.
So, Steve, we'll have you give us the last word as we end up our panel on the future of business and markets. So let me ask you this question. What have we learned in 2020 that you didn't think was a lesson? Now, what are the lessons we've learned from this COVID panic? Have we learned that, well, one of them, I think, is that governors are having way too much executive power. Isn't there any way we can restrain their one-man decisions to close down the economy and so on? Weren't you shocked by the amount of emergency power that was given over time, and we didn't know how bad this would be, and yet these people, they get away with anything. They're hungry with power. What do you think? What are your lessons? And give us an optimistic outlook for the next for 2020 and this new decade.
I think the emergency powers most of the public would have supported in February, March, perhaps early April. But I think you're going to see, Mark, enormous court cases coming in the future that are going to deal with these things, not now in this time of panic, but are going to be severely restricting that if you want to do certain things, you must get the consent of the governed through legislative processes. And so I think there is going to be a great reaction to this overreaction on the part of governors, relying more on hunches than on science and stuff like that. And also, I think there's beginning to be a real reaction to what Alex referred to. Moral universities are now going to face fundamental questions about their moral authority, given the abdication they've had to these vandalism forces against free speech. You're starting to see movements around the country on that. And so I think you're going to see huge transformations in education, where you're going to see many more ways of getting an education than the traditional 4 years. And a lot of those 4-year institutions, which really are 6 years, are going to go down, and no small part because they've charged a lot of money, delivered very little. And so I think one thing that's coming out of COVID is we're getting a fundamental questioning. What is college all about? What are our universities delivering? And I think people are reacting very, very fundamentally against the excesses there. Those people in authority lost their moral authority by what they've done. And I think in the next few years, you're going to see a positive transformation if we get this election right. And that's key. What kind of country do we want to be? And I think the surge, Mark, of patriotism on the 4th of July, which of course the mainstream media largely ignored, shows the American people as a whole. The body politic is healthy, even if a lot of the participants are particularly unhealthy for us.
Well, that's a great way to end our 2-hour emergency meeting. I want to thank Jonathan Ward, Alex Green and Steve Forbes for wrapping it up for us. And we've raised a lot of great issues. I want to thank everybody who participated in this. I want to thank our staff, in particular, Valerie and Matt, and Autumn and Nathan and Haley, and my wife Joanne, who runs the film festival and everybody worked literally thousands of hours to put this together. And I want to thank all of them for their work. I want to mention, you can see this. This is a new business card for Freedom Fest for next year in 2021. Our theme is healthy, wealthy, and wise. Healthy, wealthy, and wise. And it's July 14th through the 17th, 2021 at the Paris. We're going back to the Paris Resort in Las Vegas. And hopefully we won't have to wear masks. We'll have some freedom. We won't have to engage in social distancing, and we can have a wonderful opportunity. I know we have over 800 people who have kept their registration till next year, so we could have a record crowd next year. Really looking forward to it. And thanks again for being a part of Freedom Fest, and may Freedom Fest come back bigger and stronger than ever before. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.